Chapter 20. The first couple of months after our wedding, my focus was still very much on supporting my sister. Going into hiding in Sweden was not as straightforward as we had hoped. Abigail was not allowed to stay with her and ended up returning to Jerusalem while trying to figure out what to do next. It was incredibly hard carrying the burden of making sure that my older sister was all right. Thankfully, my mother was helping out with financial support, but she was living in a different part of Sweden, so it was really up to Susanna to make it on her own now, and it weighed heavily on me. Her escaping from Egypt had not gone down well with my dad. After a couple of months, I had a call from Jerusalem. He hardly ever called me. Initially, a few emails from him had shown me that he thought that Susanna had done the wrong thing by leaving and breaking her marriage covenant. As a man, her husband had the right to treat her whichever way he wanted. He was the head of the family. All the same crap I had heard in bits and pieces growing up. Now my dad was calling me in Adelaide, and his voice was getting louder and louder. Did I realize what I had done to our family? Could I not see what this meant? I explained that I had helped my sister get away from a dangerous man and that 2 kids didn't have to live in fear anymore. My dad roared. He sounded like a wild animal. "You brought a curse into our family. You've cursed us." My face was burning. "When you left your husband, you brought a curse into this family. The curse began with you, and you then spread it to your mother, so she left me, and now you have spread it into your sister's life. She was married to a minister, a godly man, and your curse has broken them apart." Curse? I brought a curse? "You've cursed our family." "Dad, I don't know what curse you're talking about." "It's a curse from the women in the family. It's the Magnusson curse." He's referring to my mother's maiden name, Morfar's last name. Who knew that he had a curse named after him? And a curse only pertaining to women? It was ludicrous. My face was still burning, but my dad was sounding crazier and crazier. I held the phone away from my ear and listened to him rage. He was seriously nuts. He kept going, and I just sat there waiting for him to run out of things to say. Once he settled down somewhat, his breathing still heavy, I very calmly told him that I was incredibly sad that he could not see that his daughter and 2 grandchildren were now safe, that he was so focused on what was right and wrong that he had lost sight of his daughter's safety. I told him that his children being safe had never been his priority as a father, and obviously nothing had changed. I explained that I only had so much energy, and I was giving it all to my own family as well as helping Susanna. I had nothing left. If he couldn't be supportive as a dad right now, I didn't want to hear from him. I reminded him that he would only send me emails if he was trying to preach at me for living in sin with the father of my children, or to tell me his latest health gospel. I didn't want it. None of it. I wanted a dad, and if he couldn't be a dad to me, I didn't want to hear from him. I asked him to not email or call me again. I would love to hear from him when he could be my dad. I would no longer be in contact with a preacher or a health guru. I needed to take that break. I needed to make that break. My energy levels were running on empty. And at least this was one way to preserve whatever was left. It didn't go down well in the family. My brothers were furious with me. So was Carla, Sam's wife. How could I do that to my father? I was acting like a spoiled brat. It was so disrespectful. Not one of them understood that I couldn't engage with a father who chose danger for his kids. I didn't even want to try to explain myself. I was so over the whole family drama. I felt it on such a deep level inside my body that as a family, we had it so wrong. I couldn't even explain it exactly. I just knew we were so wrapped up in some warped value system that allowed for women to be mistreated in the name of God or Christianity, or maybe it wasn't even that. Somehow I had done something wrong in helping my sister. I had done something against my family for leaving my husband, and somehow I was to blame for my parents splitting up. There was no point in me trying to get my dad or even my brothers to see things from my perspective. The thing was, I never heard from my brothers anyway. It wasn't as if we had this connection that was now damaged because of what I had done. They had showed so little interest in my life, and it was very clear they didn't know me. The last time I had spoken to my older brother, Raphael, I realized he didn't even know the names of my children, and he had made some comment about me smoking pot and drinking alcohol. Maybe he'd seen a photo from my wedding with me having dreadlocks. I had laughed it off by explaining that Andrew and I might be the only couple in Australia who have never been drunk. I had never even been tipsy. In fact, I couldn't remember the last time I had even tasted alcohol. And pot? Again, never even tried it. Neither had Andrew. It wasn't even about that, though. It was realizing how little my brothers knew about me and the assumption he could make based on random snippets of information and photos that would be emailed out. If he wanted to be angry at me for not letting my dad rage at me about some Magnuson curse I had brought into the family, then so be it. It's not as if it would. It's not as if I would all of a sudden miss out on a weekly roast with my brothers and their families. Sam was angry at me as well, but he took a different approach. Dad is so sick and weak. How can you do this to him? It will break his heart. He had a point. Dad was sick and weak, but that wasn't stopping him from saying awful things about me and not taking the opportunity to patch things up with his daughter. If anything, his weak heart was making him bolder and more judgmental. I had zero interest in catering to my dad or my brothers. Things in my own home were tricky enough to deal with. Both me and Andrew were getting restless with our day-to-day existence. Andrew was working 4 days a week, which meant he could spend more time with the kids than most dads. I was starting to toy with the idea of maybe getting some work. I knew that Andrew struggled a lot with the way I spent money. He especially struggled with how much I spent on food. Money was becoming more and more of a hot topic for us, and I thought that maybe I could start contributing in some way. I had never actually worked before, besides being a waitress, and what I really wanted to do was counseling. I had recently started going along to the Jewish school in Adelaide. They had an international play group, and I loved taking the girls there because it meant being exposed to different languages and interesting people. I was struggling so much with the level of conversation among our friends, and my weekly playgroup meant that I could get away from chatting about new Tupperware designs and kitchen extensions. I loved our weekly outing. The school was small, but it had kids from around the globe. My heart went out to them because I knew so well how hard it is to be a third culture kid. Coming from one culture, living in another, and not really fitting into either, and belonging to this subculture of misfits. That was me. And I knew that a lot of the kids at this school would be feeling the same and dealing with similar pressures. What if I offered to come and do some volunteering here as a counselor? It would be a great experience for me and would give me something to put on my very, very, very empty resume. I would be contributing to something I felt strongly about, and hopefully down the track, it would mean that I get some employment out of it. The more I thought about it, the more it appealed to me. I was excited to tell Andrew because it would show him that I had heard him about the money spending and that I did want to help out. I wasn't just planning on leeching off him forever. He was just as capable as me in the home, so leaving the kids with him wouldn't be an issue. When we eventually had a chance to chat, I brought it up as an option. I explained how on Fridays when he was home, I would go out and do counseling for a few hours at a school. Andrew shot it down immediately. Why would you do that? Fridays are our family time. The whole reason I stay home on Fridays is so that we can be together as a family. If you go out and work, that totally defeats the purpose of me being home. Here it was. Andrew dismissing something that was important to me and totally missing what I was saying. We already had family time. We had Saturdays and Sundays like most other couples. Yes, it was great having Fridays as well, but surely me going out for a few hours wasn't such a big deal. I explained that I was hoping to get some work out of it. I shouldn't have bothered. Andrew went into great detail about how much he earned per hour and that it would take me years to match that. If we wanted more money, then it was a lot more logical for him to work. He could earn in a couple of hours what I could make in a day. I knew he was right, but he was missing the point. This was me trying to contribute something outside of the home and expand my world a bit. Take some steps at making our dynamic more balanced so that Andrew didn't have to carry the financial burden completely. I wanted to show him that I respected his role with the kids and that we didn't have to have traditional roles as husband and wife. I really thought he would like the idea. He didn't. Andrew and I were both hungry for something to change in our life. Once the kids were in bed, we would talk about how we could bring more meaning into our existence. We kept coming back to the idea of communal living. It seemed like the best way to live the values we had. We could cut costs down by sharing our belongings with like-minded people. We loved the idea of communal meals, not just cooking for our own family and raising our kids with other kids of different ages. I was constantly trying to meet with friends, but it was getting harder and harder. My style of homeschooling fell into the free-range bracket, so we didn't follow any time schedules. This meant that we were constantly able to pop down to Chinatown for lunch or to the beach to collect shells or find a playground to explore. It was a lot more fun to do with others. Sadly, our homeschooling friends were locked into their routines, and our other friends didn't have kids our age. It was getting harder to do things in the evening as well. We didn't have any family to watch our kids, so it either meant we brought our 4 kids along or just one of us went out. Initially, we would bring the kids everywhere, but I was starting to realize that this wasn't really appreciated by our friends who either didn't have any children or they just had one little one who would sleep in the side room. Our kids were out and about, chatting away to our friends and happy to interact. I knew our friends liked our kids, but they weren't so happy to have them there for the evening events. I could also tell that it was getting a bit tedious with our friends, and that me and Andrew were constantly bringing up communal living as the answer. We were becoming a bit of a broken record. By now, we had moved into a gorgeous house in Bridgewater that felt way too big for us. Initially, we had hoped to share it with friends, but then we thought it might be great to have some asylum seekers come and live with us instead. We put the word out, and after quite a long time, we were told that we would have a young Kenyan man move in. We were all very excited since it had taken a lot more effort to organize than we had anticipated. Andrew went off with our car and trailer to finally collect our new friend, who had already come up for dinner a couple of times to get to know us. Once the trailer was loaded, I got a call from Andrew. Our search would have to continue because our Kenyan friend wasn't moving in. It turned out that Andrew had gone into his living room to help load boxes into our trailer when he had seen a whole bunch of pornographic DVDs and magazines. It had shocked Andrew to see that this guy wasn't even trying to hide it. There's no way Andrew was comfortable with having a guy with that sort of stuff come and live with us. It was really disappointing, but at the same time, I was thankful that Andrew had been so proactive. It would have been very hard to do this with the trailer already half loaded and ready to go. It meant a lot to me that Andrew had that integrity to do that. It took us a few more weeks to find someone else, and we ended up having 2 ladies from Iran move in with us. I was embarrassed at how naive I had been with the Kenyan guy and how I hadn't even thought that there might be something like porn to consider. At least with these Iranian ladies, we didn't have to worry about that. It was a mother and a daughter. The daughter was in her 50s and the mother in her 70s. I was looking forward to learning how to cook Persian food and hearing about their culture. Instead, we spent most of the time wondering what we'd done wrong. They both seemed angry to be in our house and upset to be so far away from the city. They kept to themselves as much as possible, and when they did talk to me, they liked to remind me how much they didn't like my husband. I struggled with him as well, but I didn't need 2 house guests to add to that. I don't like people who are ungrateful at the best of times, and here were 2 women being so critical while living in our home. The kids didn't warm to them at all, which was no surprise, really. The older woman was the only one who showed them any attention, and with her not being able to speak a word of English, she would just shriek really loudly when they did something cute. With 2 adorable toddlers in the house, the shrieking was pretty much constant whenever the women ventured out of the room. Susanna's court case was coming up in Sweden, and I flew over to support her. It had been an incredibly hard year for her, and I knew this court case was pushing her to the limits. I wanted to sit with her because I knew that having Yusuf in the same building was scaring her. We weren't sure if Susanna had to be in the same room as him, and even just the thought of that was making her shake. Both Ezra and Abigail flew over from Jerusalem to be there as well, which was so wonderful. It meant a lot to me that Ezra showed his concern in such a practical way. I knew that he was caught in a hard place with my dad so opposed to what had happened with Susanna, and Ezra and my dad were really close. So for him to come and support his sister was a beautiful gesture. My mother wanted to help as well. She had been amazing with supporting Susanna financially the past 12 months, and she offered to do whatever she could to help out on the day. We arrived to the courthouse and were told to sit in a small room and wait while the lawyers discussed the case. It seemed to be taking a long time, with our lawyer coming back to our room for clarification every few minutes. I could see that it was taking its toll for Susanna, so I offered to go into the room with the lawyers and see if I could help out. It only took a few minutes. Yusuf's lawyer was very grateful for my help, and he was surprised I was saying that we were open for him to see his children. I explained that as long as there was someone supervising the visits to make sure the children were safe, we were happy for him to have access. The lawyers seemed to be expecting us to deny Yusuf any access. I explained that once the children were older, they would be able to decide for themselves if they wanted to see him more or less, but for now we were suggesting 3 times a year. Yusuf's lawyer agreed straight away and thanked me for our generosity. I had expected the lawyer to be opposing our request, but that wasn't the case at all. I wasn't sure if it was a Swedish thing for lawyers to be so respectful and positive, but the whole exchange was very straightforward, and they seemed genuinely concerned for Susanna and her children's safety. They didn't say it outright, but I did get the feeling that they knew that Yusuf could not be trusted without supervision. I walked back to our little waiting room and told Susanna what had happened. It was a huge relief to have the long day over with, and we just needed to try and leave the building without meeting Yusuf in the corridor. Ezra offered to find out where he was and returned to say that Yusuf was pacing up and down the street in front of the entrance to the building. We had organized for our mother to drive past and pick us up from the side of the building, but that wouldn't work now. We called her and explained that we needed to find another way out, and we asked her to wait for instructions. After a few minutes of debating what we should do if Yusuf didn't leave, we were told by the caretaker of the courthouse that they were locking up and that we would need to leave. We explained that we had this giant Egyptian man pacing up and down the front of the building waiting for us, and we were hoping to avoid him. The caretaker stepped outside to have a look for himself and agreed that it was best if we found another way out. He took us through the building, down the corridors, and through this dark basement. Eventually, we got to a tiny door that he said led out to a side alley. Ezra called our mother and told her which street to wait at. Then we ran out, ducking through the door, across a wet town square, trying not to slip on the cobbled street. Our mother's little car screeched to a stop, and we all hopped in and drove off. I looked over at Susanna and asked if she thought we would get Sally Field to play our mother in the movie. Susanna's lawyers asked me to be there for Yusuf's first supervised visit with the children a few days later. Thankfully, Yusuf didn't say a word to me. I wasn't surprised. The last interaction I had with him was over the phone. He had called me a few days after Susanna arrived in Sweden. He was screaming at me and demanding to know where his wife was, cursing and praying that God would punish me. I had been expecting his call, so when he quieted down for a moment, I pretended that his son was next to me, and I said in a stage whisper, "Shh, don't speak. Your dad might hear you." Yusuf fell for it and demanded to speak to his son. This meant that for the first few weeks before Susanna was able to get legal protection because of the Christmas season in Sweden, Yusuf thought that she had flown to Australia to hide with me, and it meant that he didn't fly to Sweden to look for her. He was definitely not happy to see me here for the first visit with his children. I had only been gone for about 10 days, but when I returned to Adelaide, Andrew informed me that our Iranian house guest had left after a big blow-up. I was relieved. The last thing I needed was more drama, especially in my home. With the court case behind me and now having our home back to just us, our life got back into some sort of rhythm. I was starting to spend more time with Astrid, my friend who had made the felt dreadlocks for my hair. She was now teaching me how to crochet in her bus. I would go one morning a week, drink chai and eat bliss balls, and learn how to crochet beanies and gloves. I loved it. I had never met a woman who was so skilled in so many ways. It seemed as if there was nothing she couldn't do. She explained that she had done all her schooling in a Waldorf Steiner school, which meant that she was taught how to create beautiful things from wool and wood. I was very impressed. It also explained why she started each day barefoot and made sure she stood under the sun each day for energy. I noticed that she often mentioned the moon. She would work it into the conversation so effortlessly, as if she was talking about a friend. Things have been really hard at the moment. I just had to go and sit under Luna for a little bit last night to clear my head. Or, I'm going to wait until the full moon to start my next project. It seems silly to start without Luna's help. I would just go along with it, even though it was so foreign to me. I knew we spoke the same language, but her reality seemed so different to mine. She was in tune with the sky and the seasons. She had an energy about her that was so vibrant. She was the most creative person I'd ever met, and her eyes were lit up with imagination. I loved that and was drawn to her way of being. I was craving friends so much that I was willing to overlook a lot of beige in order to have someone to hang out with. But with Astrid, it was different. She was full of life and never stopped creating something. Her feet always seemed dirty and her hands looked as if she had been working in the fields. Yet she would be able to weave the most beautiful baskets as we sat under a tree with our kids playing around us, her hands busily making row after row. Whenever she came over to my house, she would dig through my recycling and shriek with joy when she would find an orange netting or shower scrubber. How could I throw out such treasures? She would then weave them into her baskets and create the most delicate creations from these scraps I didn't see any value in. I once went along to an exhibition she had, and I recognized items from my house and bits and pieces of wool and fabric from clothing I had given her. When I couldn't handle my itchy scalp anymore from the dreadlocks, I chopped them off in a heated moment, seeking relief. As I looked at the colorful dreadlocks in my hands, I knew they would make a beautiful basket. I was starting to see the world through Astrid eyes. One of the other great things about Astrid was that she also had 4 kids, so she understood the intensity of the constant chaos. She also had a very hands-on dad to her children, and they seemed to have similar tensions between them as a couple, like me and Andrew. This constant power play going on in their relationship. We didn't talk about it much, but when it came up, Astrid would always ask me where I was in my cycle. My cycle? It took me a while to realize she was asking me about my period. I found it pretty confronting, mainly because I never talked about my period, and secondly, because I had no idea where I was in my cycle. I hardly bled at all since having a contraceptive device implanted. A doctor had recommended it to me when I asked him about getting my tubes tied after Sage was born. He explained that there are a lot more risks involved with tubes tying than they had initially realized, and he recommended I try this other thing called a Mirena. I wasn't really interested because I knew that I had reacted badly to anything hormonal in my body. He insisted that it was worth looking into since it would only affect my uterus and not my whole system. In the end, I decided to try it since I could easily have it removed if it started to cause any issues. It didn't, and I loved it. It made my periods so light that I hardly noticed them. It was the perfect contraception as far as I was concerned. Astrid was horrified when I told her. How could I have a foreign object in my body like that? Surely it will create friction as my body tries to reject it. Thankfully, I had no issues, and I didn't have to think about it at all. So when Astrid asked me about my cycle, it was hard to know where I was at all. I knew I was horny when I ovulated. I knew it was easier for me to start crying in the week leading up to my period, but that was about it. Crying was pretty common for me most days. Andrew and I were having so many arguments over nothing, and I felt as if I felt as if he was constantly criticizing me over things. He claimed I was doing the same to him, so we were in this constant stalemate situation that was so incredibly draining. I felt misunderstood and confused about where we were as a couple. Every so often I would write Andrew a letter and try and explain myself, but I had to save those for when I really needed them. Otherwise, I would be writing letters weekly. I was also meeting with women once a month who home birthed. It was a great mix of women. They were obviously the more alternative ones that didn't like to follow the system. Hairy legs and armpits and babies wrapped to their chest. I had kind of expected mothers like that. What I really liked was that there were more and more mainstream women coming along to the meetings. Many of them had had traumatic experiences in the hospital system and wanted to make sure that when they were giving birth the next time, they were listened to and treated with respect. We would sit in a circle, and often the tears would flow as the women shared their stories. Not just women, sometimes dads would come along as well. It felt good to be part of something meaningful. Not a lot of my friends had understood why we had chosen to birth at home, so it was good to be with like-minded people. I knew that my midwife, Lisa, was getting a lot of negative attention from the media, so I really wanted to make sure she felt supported as well. It was a tough time for her, and she had given a lot to us in our 2 home births, and this felt like a chance to give something back to her. In many ways, I felt trapped in 2 worlds. My mainstream friends were referring to me more and more as a hippie. We didn't have a TV or a microwave. We were homeschooling, home birthing, and talking about communal living. On the other hand, to my alternative friends, I was mainstream with our very big house, 2 cars, engineer husband, eating meat, and quite conservative views on life. Asher and Tikva weren't spending much time with Paul anymore. He was only asking to see them for about a couple of hours at a time. He was angry at me for not letting him drive them anywhere and said that he didn't want them at his house if he couldn't take them places in his car. He didn't seem to understand that his drinking, and more importantly, his lying about his drinking, was making it very hard for me to trust him with the kids. He had arrived to collect them for a family event, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. He insisted that he hadn't been drinking, and I just couldn't get past the smell. I wanted to believe him, and I didn't want my kids to miss out on a family event at their grandparents' house, but I decided to keep them with me. Paul got back in the car and drove off. I found out later that he'd collapsed shortly after and had ended up in hospital. The kids were becoming more uncomfortable with his behavior as well, and telling me that he seemed strange. I assumed it was his medication making his speech slurred. He had become very overweight the past couple of years, and his body movements were much slower. I agreed with the kids and that he did seem strange, but at the same time, he was still their dad, and as long as he didn't drive them, I felt as if they were safe to be with him. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from his mother, Marge. Paul was in hospital. He had been in a fight at the pub. Someone had mentioned the date, and Paul let them know that they were wrong. He thought it was February 2001. They laughed at him and said he was years off. Supposedly, it got aggressive enough that the police were called, and Paul was taken to a psychiatric hospital. He was totally convinced it was February 2001 and that he had a wife and 2 children. Marge wanted to know if I could bring the kids into the hospital to show Paul that they weren't the 2 and 3-year-old kids he claimed to have. Maybe seeing them all grown up would bring him to his senses. Bring my kids into psychiatric hospital to get their dad into the right year? No, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't even consider it. They already thought he was strange and felt uncomfortable around him. There was no way I was going to use them as some sort of a trigger to get Paul back to 2009. Even as an adult, psychiatric hospitals were disturbing. There's no way I would take them there. I was shocked she even asked. I said I would be happy to help and come down to talk to him, or if the doctors needed any more information that I might be able to help with, I could talk to them on the phone or in person. But that was it. The kids would not be part of the offer until Paul was in the right time zone again. It felt awful saying no to Marge, but I just couldn't have my kids exposed to any more bizarre behavior from their father. Asher and Tikva really saw Andrew as their dad. They would hardly ever even ask about Abba anymore. They adored Andrew and loved to ask him about the planets and the stars, and he still loved telling them about his trip to India. He was even suggesting that we move there as a family. He had started to learn Hindi and was really good at it. I knew he loved it there, and I tried to look into some places that might work for us. Maybe Andrew teaching in an international school in the foothills of the Himalayas. I could counsel third culture kids. Could that work? Or maybe Andrew as an engineer in Pune. It sounded like a nice option when I researched Indian cities. I tried to get my head around it, but the more I thought about it, the less comfortable I felt about bringing 3 young girls into a country where girls were openly mistreated on the streets. I didn't want to have to be one of those expat families that were locked away from the locals. Another thing that was really concerning me was our health. We seemed to be getting lots of tummy bugs, and I couldn't understand why. All of us were taking turns getting giardia with eggy burps, bad stomach cramps, and diarrhea. If we were getting that in the Adelaide Hills, then surely we wouldn't survive in India. I was mainly concerned for Summer. Out of all of us, she seemed to be the one getting sick the most. She was such a content and happy girl with these gorgeous blonde spiral curls around her face. She was happy but exhausted. She seemed to be getting tired even between her naps. I tried to bring it up with Andrew, but he dismissed it as me being hypervigilant yet again. He was pretty fed up with my constant quest for health, frustrated with me for spending money on supplements and constantly tweaking what I was eating to get healthier. I could understand that it would be hard for him, but I was getting desperate. I had never felt this exhausted before, and I was getting sick pretty often. If it wasn't my tonsils, it was a tummy bug, and I was starting to feel sick after eating certain foods too, and my hay fever was worse than ever. I went to a doctor who specialized in natural health. She started telling me that I needed to cook broth for my gut and to stop eating dairy. It didn't really make sense and seemed so strict. I had tried a lot of things over the years, and I found it hard to stick to anything for very long. Asher's skin had improved on his face when he had acupuncture, but his body was still covered in eczema, and we were spending a lot of money trying to find ointments that would help soothe his rashes. I knew Andrew hated hearing about our ailments, so when I saw a lump on Summer's belly, I dreaded saying anything. When I did show him, he tried to convince me it was nothing. I agreed that it was tiny, but had looked bigger when Summer had strained while reaching for something. Eventually, I convinced Andrew that we needed to get her checked by a doctor. I also got him to agree to a blood test for her. I was getting really concerned about how lethargic she was. She was reminding me more and more of a rag doll. I knew Summer loved the library, and the day she begged to go to the library, only to lie on the floor the whole time sucking her fingers, too tired to even look at any books, I knew something was wrong. Our doctor agreed that some tests were needed. Not only did Summer have a hernia, her blood test showed that she was very likely celiac. That would explain her bloated belly and her exhaustion. Because of my Swedish heritage, the specialist explained that we wouldn't really need a biopsy because it was so likely to be celiac as it's a common disease in Scandinavia. Andrew wanted the biopsy done. He needed proof that his little girl really needed to have gluten removed from her diet for the rest of her life. Thankfully, the surgeons agreed to work together so that Summer could have her hernia fixed the same time the biopsy was done. Only a few days later, the results came back. She was diagnosed as celiac. Her stomach lining was damaged from the gluten we had been feeding her. It was so upsetting. I had been expecting the results, but it was still incredibly hard to have someone say that our daughter had a lifelong condition to deal with. Andrew was upset as well, and I was really hoping he would acknowledge that I was right in seeking help for a girl, or in some way tell me that maybe I wasn't a hypochondriac after all, and thank me for being in tune with my kids. It never happened. The hospital offered us a training session for people diagnosed with celiac disease. We were told how critical it is to not have any contamination with gluten. Even one crumb can cause weeks of damage. A crumb? I pictured my kitchen. I was constantly baking and cooking. There were crumbs everywhere. There was no way we could try and keep things for summer gluten-free and continue as we were. Thankfully, Andrew agreed that it would also make summer feel left out if we didn't all go gluten-free at home. I was so daunted by the thought of cleaning up my kitchen, wiping every shelf, removing any remnant of gluten that might make my little girl sick. I asked Andrew if he could take the kids for 3 days. I didn't care where. I just needed to go through my kitchen from top to bottom and start afresh. I thought about how things would be so different now. Could we even eat at Chinatown anymore? What could I bake for the kids? All my recipes were based on wheat flour. So many times when I was out with the kids, we would just stay longer than expected, so I would buy pita bread and hummus as a snack. That would have to stop now. And what about when we met up with friends? Would I need to keep Summer away from the food so she wouldn't grab something that would make her sick? It all seemed so hard, so antisocial. We were free spirits, and now we had to become those anal people who couldn't eat what was offered. Paul's parents had struggled so much with me not letting the kids drink soft drink and eat chocolate when they were toddlers. This was 100 times worse than that. Thankfully, Asher and Tikva seemed to understand, and we explained to them that we would eat gluten-free in the house, but when they were out, they could eat gluten as long as they did it discreetly and didn't eat Summer's favorite foods in front of her. I decided that I would become gluten-free as well to see if it would improve my health. I felt unwell, but I couldn't exactly define in which way. I was heavier than I'd ever been before and exhausted. I was either constipated or had diarrhea. My lower back was also sore. Nothing was right, but I couldn't put it into words. I had a blood test that showed my estrogen levels were way too high. The doctor recommended a progesterone cream for me to rub into my belly, but it would cost about $60 a month. I knew that would be too much money to expect Andrew to pay for something that wasn't really medicine as such. With all our other expenses, it seemed like a luxury. The unease in my body was matching my unease in our relationship. Andrew was becoming more and more interested in politics, Middle East politics to be exact. He was quickly becoming an expert on the topic. He was about 4 chapters into his first Noam Chomsky book when I noticed him bringing Middle East politics up at any opportunity. I didn't mind. It was definitely more interesting than him talking about engines and machines. I did struggle, though, with his need to sound as if he had the answers, and he really wanted me to have opinions on things that related to Israel. What exactly did I think about the occupation? He wanted to know. I tried to explain to him that it wasn't as easy as that. I actually didn't know how I felt about it. I was confused. I had classmates who told me they wouldn't be happy until all the Jews were in the sea. At the same time, I had Israeli friends who told me that killing Palestinian mothers was okay because they were just giving birth to terrorists anyways. Andrew insisted I have an opinion. Couldn't I see that Israel was the oppressor? Well, I could, but I also knew that reading one book on the topic was very different to stepping onto a bus in Jerusalem and wondering if it was going to blow up, or having a friend describe what it's like to step over body parts after missing a bomb by a matter of seconds. Andrew wanted me to have a black and white answers. Well, he wanted me to agree with him and Chomsky. I couldn't. For me, it was much more complex than that. I tried to explain to Andrew that there were people who tried to stay clear of the politics and instead focused on the people. Friends like Danya, who was part of a group attempting to create bridges between Israelis and Palestinians and find ways for them to connect and talk about the things they had in common. Remove the political language, try to reconcile the differences, and focus on our shared humanity. If I had to be anywhere in the conflict, that's where I wanted to be. But really, I didn't even want to have this conversation with Andrew at all. Why talk about the Middle East when we had our very own conflict to deal with? Why read Chomsky when our marriage needed all the help it could get? It amazed me how much time and energy Andrew had to discuss anything that he felt passionate about. Yet when it came to matters of the heart, it felt as if there was a no-go zone. I would only get a few words in before Andrew would accuse me of something or highlight that I was even worse of a spouse than him. I finally told Andrew that he needed to keep Chomsky out of the bedroom, and he needed to get a friend to fill that need. I had already said the same about engines. I was not the person to talk to about engines. This had genuinely upset Andrew, and he said it hurt him that he was married to someone who couldn't share that part of his life. I tried to explain that it was the equivalent of me talking to him about crochet patterns and different types of wool as he tried to make love to me. It's not the time or the place, or the right person for that matter. With 4 kids to raise, there isn't much time to talk. I didn't want to use up that precious space with engines and Chomsky. Surely that wasn't so hard to understand. It was. On one of the rare nights when Andrew and I were trying to be proactive about our future by coming up with a solution instead of just going around in circles, we decided to make a list of our options. What was actually feasible? What about moving to Queensland and joining a community up there? Buying some land with a wind farm and trying to live off the grid? Managing a school camp? Buying a bus and traveling around Australia? All our options meant lots of money was needed, and lots of money meant Andrew having to work, which meant him being away from the kids, and the whole point was for him to spend more time with them and me. What about us moving to Bali for 6 months? Andrew was really surprised. Would I really move to Bali? He wanted to know. He assumed it wasn't an option since India was off the list. I said that India seemed so extreme, but I might be able to handle Bali. Andrew's face lit up as he wrote 6 months in Bali on our list. One of the girls called out from bed, so Andrew went to settle her, and I quickly jumped on the computer. Ariella was online, a new friend of Andrew's. He had met her a few times at Engineers Without Borders events. It was one of the things he had gotten involved with recently since becoming more aware of social justice issues. She was an incredible woman, possibly the most intelligent woman I had ever met, her mind constantly buzzing. This wonderful combination of intelligence, social justice, eclectic dress sense, and red lipstick. I really liked her. I hardly ever saw her, but would bump into her occasionally on Facebook. I decided to ask her what she thought. Where do you think we should move as a family, anywhere in Australia or in the world? She answered immediately, Cambodia. That's all she said. Cambodia? I didn't even know where that was. Somewhere in Asia. Why Cambodia? You will love it. It's perfect for you guys. Andrew came back from the bedroom and I told him that Ariella thought we should move to Cambodia. He looked at me. Would you move to Cambodia? The walls were closing in on me. The conversation about towels versus splashbacks in the kitchen were giving me a rash. Library books that went missing no matter what I tried. I had to get out. Suburbia was killing me. Yes, I would move to Cambodia. I really would. I would move pretty much anywhere right now. Okay, not India, but anywhere that my kids would be safe and we could get some gluten-free food. The next day, we had a letter in the mailbox. It was from our real estate agent. They were not renewing our lease. We had 6 weeks to move out. Our answer had come. We were moving to Cambodia. It was an incredible feeling. I couldn't wait to get rid of all our stuff. This was the most beautiful home I had ever lived in. We had a magical garden with a creek running through it. A train would go past and there was a tunnel under the train tracks that the kids would love to play in. We had a basketball court, massive trees to climb, and I just couldn't wait to leave. I had enough of it all. We organized a garage sale where we hardly asked for any money. We were practically begging people to take our belongings. The only items I wanted to keep were photos, some of the kids' sentimental stuff, and Mormor's paintings. Andrew's dad was getting remarried in 4 weeks, so we decided to spend our last 2 weeks in Melbourne. We had bought a house over there with the money from Andrew's mum, so it was a good chance to check how it was going, as well as spend some time with Andrew's sister, and of course, go to the wedding. A couple of days later, we had our trailer packed and we waved goodbye to our lovely home in the Adelaide Hills. It was July 2009. Our 2 weeks in Melbourne were fairly busy. It was good to check out the house we owned and to remind ourselves what it looked like. We had made a point of renting it out to people we thought would struggle to find other rentals. So our first tenant was a family with 5 kids, and now we had a single mother with 3 kids and her mum in there. It was great to be able to come to the wedding and see Andrew's dad happy. I really didn't know much about Melbourne at all. Andrew grew up in the northeastern suburbs, and there wasn't much there besides a big shopping centre, lots of trees, and about 25 minutes away, a weekly hippie market. The most important thing for me was that we had family there, and that meant that we could hopefully get some help with the kids and get away for a night. I really wanted a chance to spend some time with Andrew alone. It was so rare that we had the chance. His sister agreed to have the kids for a night so that we could get away. It was our last weekend in Australia, and we had been out and about doing errands when I had a phone call. The caller asked if I was in a car. I said, yes, and they said they would call back. They called again a few minutes later and I explained that it was fine to talk. Was I sitting down? Yes, I was sitting down. I looked over at Andrew and showed him my concern. This sounded weird. Was I Veronica Sherman, the wife of Paul? Yes and no. I was Veronica Sherman, but no longer the wife of Paul. They apologized and explained that they were calling from the South Australian Police. According to the records, I was still listed as Paul's wife. They were sorry to tell me that Paul had passed away. Did I know anyone that needed to be informed? Paul had passed away? My eyes welled up. Oh no, Paul was dead. Dead. I had felt this coming for so many years, but it was still such a shock. And here I was in Melbourne. I had always pictured getting this call and then driving straight to his parents' house to be with them if they got the news, or at least call someone who they were close with to sit with them as they were told. This was horrible, for them to get a knock on the door from the police with no warning. I started to cry as I thought about how Marge had been dreading that knock for years, knowing that her son was such a troubled soul. The police went on to say that they had found his body in his house. He had been watching TV as he died. They didn't have many details, but it didn't look like suicide. Oh wow, Paul had died. He had died while watching TV. It was hard to digest the news. I gave the police the address of Paul's parents and told them to please be really gentle. This would be very hard for them. The funeral was booked for the day after we left Australia. I asked Asher and Tikva if they wanted to fly back to Adelaide with me and go to the funeral. They didn't. I told them to really think about it, but they insisted they really didn't want to go. They agreed that the next time we were back in Adelaide, we would go to his grave and bring a little gift. 3 days later, we got on a plane for Cambodia.